Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you so much for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. So happy to bring on board as our guest today, Asa Waldstein. He is a certified clinical herbalist with 20 years of experience developing and implementing compliant marketing and GMP manufacturing processes in the dietary supplement and hemp industries. Asa has formulated, manufactured, and marketed hundreds of products in a compliant manner and has helped oversee 3 FDA CFR 111 audits. And we're going to talk about what all those mean. Asa is a former AHPA board member and current chair of AHPA's Cannabis Committee. He is the CEO of the regulatory consulting company called Supplement Advisory Group, and he is the founder of the Regulatory Education Series platform, which regularly hosts free events for the community, FDA and FTC enforcement trend analysis, and social media marketing principles and manufacturing efficacy principles. And you can find him at asawaldstein.com. That's ASAWALDSTEIN.com. And on our podcast archive for this show, because all radio shows are now podcasts also, we will have a live link to Asa. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for being here. It's just a wonderful day. I'm calling in, or I'm recording from Colorado here, a beautiful cold day here in Colorado. So thank you so much, Ellen, for inviting me on the show today, and warm greetings to all the Herbal Years listeners out there. I would like to say that you made me sound really important with that introduction, but really I'm just kind of an herbal geek that happens to be good at making dietary supplements. So I always like to laugh when I get a great intro like that, because really I just love herbs, and I've been following my passion for the past 20 years.
Well, that's interesting on many levels, but what our focus today is about know your legal GMPs. Now, here's something that doctors say all the time and seems to be widely believed in mainstream thought, that dietary supplements are totally unregulated. What would you say to that, Asa?
Well, I would completely disagree. I'd disagree with that statement, because the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, DSHEA, which we talked before the recording, and you were actually integral in helping to put this together. You had one of the seats at the table, which is impressive, just had its 25th anniversary last year. So DSHEA, or Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, made dietary supplements legal to manufacture, sell, and market. And so dietary supplements have an oversight from the FDA under the Code of Federal Regulations 111 and 117. And this basically means that all products manufactured have to be labeled at least 100% of label claim at the time of expiration date, and that they have to be made with certain safety standards. So supplements are definitely regulated by the FDA, not as much as pharmaceuticals, but there is a pretty strict level of oversight.
And that's something interesting that you just brought up, Asa, when you said that the dietary supplements are highly regulated to a much higher degree than most people realize. Not to the extent that pharmaceutical drugs are regulated. However, that always interests me, because what it means to me is that regulation does not necessarily translate to safety. Because if we look at the safety profile and adverse effect advance reports, the difference between any dietary supplement and pharmaceutical drugs. What would you say to that?
I love that. So I would say that dietary supplements, part of the DSHEA Act that we talked about was adverse event reporting, and it is the responsibility of companies to report their serious adverse events to the FDA. And so this data is available, and if you look at the data, which APA does, the American Herbal Products Association, one of the top trade groups for the dietary supplement and cannabis industries. When APA looks at this data, it shows that dietary supplements are actually quite safe. And so I believe that supplements have a high level of safety, but regulation does not necessarily translate to safety.
That's exactly the story. And what you said that's interesting, it's not really a matter of belief systems, like you said. These are quantifiable data. In any given year, hundreds of thousands of people actually die from pharmaceutical drugs directly, let alone all of those that it might be indirectly related. So that's just what's monitored. Where in a given year, many, many years, there is not one single death linked to a dietary supplement. And there are years when there are some. During a particular 4-year period, there were actually 37 deaths that were linked to the overuse and abuse of ephedra. That was before ephedra was, basically removed from the dietary supplement category. So, 37 deaths in a 5-year period versus hundreds of thousands a year.
Yep, and so true. I am not anti-pharmaceutical. Some people certainly need them, but I've chosen to live a pharmaceutical-free life in many ways. The occasional ibuprofen, but I love that you brought up the ephedra example, because the FDA did act on the ephedra, and now that is actually a dietary supplement that's banned. It's an herb that is no longer allowed in any supplements because of the common adulteration and because of all the safety issues that happened around that plant being misused or adulterated.
So let's go back in time. What brought you into becoming an herbalist?
Oh, I love that. Thank you for asking that. So I was always interested in plants. I'd go out in the woods, and I'd want to know more about the plants. I'd see the fungi on the trees, and I wanted to know more about it. So in the late 90s, I came out. I was a guy with a girlfriend and a big blue truck and a big beard. I look a little different now. And I came out to Boulder, Colorado. So I was very lucky to get accepted to the Rocky Mountain Center of Botanical Studies. This was in 1998. And this was one of the few herb schools at that time. And I had the great opportunity to study with people like Michael Moore, James Snow, Rosita Arvigo, to name just a few of the wonderful herbalists that came through the school. And it was really interesting to reflect back on this, because in the late 90s, herbal healing or clinical herbalism was way out in left field. And I never really thought that my passion for herbs would actually turn into a career.
That's an interesting thing too, because I often teach a class called Career Paths in Natural Health. And, there really are a lot of jobs within the industry. It's not only about going outside and gathering plants. And so your interest went forward with a real specialty in the legal aspects of creating a product. So what you're doing is not looking at, let's say just gathering a plant outside, but people don't actually realize if you take that plant, even if it is a dandelion, and you want to dry it, put it in a bottle, or add alcohol, make a tincture, or whatever processing method you're using, and just put it in a bottle and sell it, that's actually highly, highly regulated, and people are always shocked to find that out.
Oh yeah, so true, so true. If you're making something for ingestible use, such as an herbal tincture, an herbal extract, a tea, there is a pretty strict government regulations. Again, that's called the CFR 111, or the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 111, and you can look it up. It's very lengthy, and it's relatively it's very vigorous, but it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So, for example, a dietary supplement company that's maybe has 2 or 3 employees or making some herbal products, they could interpret those regulations in a way that makes sense for them. And a larger company, such as a company with several hundred people, may interpret these regulations in a way that makes sense for their very large company. So they might have a more rigid interpretation of these regulations. But the Code of Federal Regulations, really the key is making sure that products are safe and that they're at label claim. And it's really interesting.
Those are 2 big things, though. So I do a lot of that regulatory consulting as well. And what I find, unfortunately, and I'd love to hear if you've had a different experience, that what you're calling a smaller company, let's say, it's very hard for them to actually comply with this vast array of regulations. I'm not so sure that if they just interpret it differently, that's going to fly if an FDA inspector comes in.
Yeah, I love that. It's impossible to comply if you have, for example, one employee, because the regulations require a doer checker system. So they require someone to weigh the product and then check by and verified. And they also have it requires a member of quality to release the components, the bottles, herbs out of the quarantine into the I'm able to mix it and use it category. QC cleared is what it's commonly called. So a smaller company, it's tough on smaller companies. And I believe, Ellen, we met through the American Herbalist Guild. And I love doing presentations and work with the AHG. It's a wonderful organization because there are a lot of these smaller herb companies that want to comply, and they're looking for guidance on how they can actually interpret those regulations.
Yes, and if anyone wants to hear that, and you have lots and lots of information about this topic, both in terms of, let's say someone thinks they want to make a little dietary supplement. Maybe it's better to check out your videos, also take a class, because unfortunately, I would say in more cases than not, it's actually very discouraging to think that that's what you're going to do because of the vast array of compliance. So it's much better to watch your video. It's still available on the American Herbalist Guild. I think there is a fee to watch it, but it's hours and hours. I believe you have a 3-hour presentation up there.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's actually 4 hours, and I believe the American Herbalist Guild is charging $30 for that. I mean, it supports a great organization. It's myself and Stephen Yeager, who is Director of Quality and Regulatory at Mountain Rose Herbs and Chair of American Herbal Products Association Board, and we're really good friends. So we just chit-chat about what's required for dietary supplement and herbal supplement companies. We actually just did an event recently called Preparing for FDA Inspections, which is myself and Stephen Yeager just talking about best practices for how to prepare for the FDA and how to conduct oneself when they arrive. And we had a lot of fun with that too.
So when you do these videos with instructions, very specific instructions, where are they posted where someone might be able to see them?
Perfect. You can link to all those through my website, asawaldstein.com. That's asawaldstein.com. And they link back to my YouTube channel, which is Dietary Supplement and Hemp Regulatory Compliance, where I host a lot of these events. And then I also chop up the events into specific questions. For example, what are considerations when you're adding hemp products and dietary supplements together? Or how are hemp companies proving safety? So there's a lot of content that can all be accessed through my website.
Well, let me reintroduce you, and then we're going to go into hemp, because boy, is that exploding. And Herbally Yours listeners, you are listening today to Herbally Yours right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. And our guest today is Asa Waldstein. He's a certified clinical herbalist with a focus on the legal aspects of marketing dietary supplements. And you can find him at Asa, A-S-A, WALDSTEIN.com. So now, not only are you having a focus in regulatory and in herbal and natural products, I imagine you do supplements as well, like not only herbal. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I do. I run the full gamut, both in my personal life and then professionally too. So through my regulatory consulting company, which I am CEO and owner of, I work with companies that make herbal supplements. They may add nutraceuticals in there. And then I do a lot of work in the hemp cannabinoid industry as well too.
And that is exploding.
Oh, yes.
Now, I recently spoke to someone who has stores, dispensaries in Colorado, so you probably know them. He has 127 locations just in Colorado. And he said because Colorado was early on in terms of allowing the medical use, that now Colorado has morphed to, what do you call it, adult use? So
Yes.
basically anyone can walk into a dispensary with an ID saying they're an adult. So that kind of eliminates that whole, medical program, which I believe we still have in New York, where you have to go to a special doctor, get a special permit, and New York does not even have dispensaries yet. So that's different in every state. How do you deal with that as a regulatory consultant? Do you know the different laws in every state?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are, the cannabis plant is commonly differentiated into the hemp side, which is kind of CBD, and it's legal hemp. It's also commonly called industrial hemp, and then marijuana. So really the big differentiation point for the listeners out there is the THC, or the stuff that gets you high, or the psychoactive molecule THC. So anything over 0.3% is considered marijuana, and that's regulated, and that's federally illegal. Anything not more than 0.3% can be construed as hemp, and can be sold more openly. So your question was related to the marijuana side, and it's really fascinating. There are, most states, I think, for the majority of the states, have a legal THC bill on the books, and yeah, as you mentioned, Ellen, they're a framework of state-by-state regulation. So in Colorado, it's very open. And as you mentioned, in New York, it's very restricted with medical only. It's fascinating to watch. But I think, over the next 4 years with the Biden administration, we're going to see some big change on that. And I believe that we will see some national, federal legalization coming to the Hill.
Well, let me just throw this question out to you. I'm not sure if you have a good answer, but I'm going to, send it out and listeners to listen to as well. There's this new movement, which there so often is lately in herbal medicine, in terms of the use of certain terms. So I have gotten pushback. Yes, the differentiation between marijuana and hemp to me is very clear, but I'm being told that the word marijuana has negative connotations, like racial connotations, that the term shouldn't be used anymore. Have you heard that at all?
No, I haven't heard that, but the cannabis plant has a long history of being demonized, and there's a lot of bad history that goes along with that, such as reefer madness. So personally, I don't really like the term marijuana. That's just a federal classification terminology.
Oh, it is. So you're telling me that. First of all, I love the term. I think there's nothing wrong with it, but I'm just, different things get like culturally inappropriate over time. It's very hard to keep up with that. But nonetheless, I like the term, but I'd be happy to not use it. But you were very clear, Asa, in terms of your use of the word hemp being actually a different subspecies of the same plant. And hemp has a much lower THC, which is the molecule that is psychoactive or gets you high. So what is going to be an appropriate word to use for the other species, which does have THC that most people prefer if they do want to get high, which has always been called marijuana? What is the new term we might use so we can differentiate between those two? I don't have the answer to that.
I think adult use cannabis is probably the best way to say it, in my opinion.
Okay, I'll remember that. That's not catchy enough, but I don't know.
No, we got to work on that one a little bit.
Yeah, so see if you get pushback on that. It's kind of interesting. So what I do is I just mention that I understand there is this discussion about appropriation or whatever. Nonetheless, I'm not sure of the right term. But what you're saying is there are different legal aspects, right, from your point, the regulatory aspect, between something that it would be called, let's call it marijuana for now, versus hemp.
Without a doubt. Yep. And again, that's differentiated by the THC content. Anything more than 0.3%, that is psychoactive, the adult use cannabis or marijuana, as we're calling it. And anything below that 0.3% is construed as industrial hemp or hemp.
Now, the stuff that's just being sold widely all over the country, another thing I have been told, and I'm wondering what your point about that is actually using CBD on the front of a label is frowned on, that it should be called hemp flower extract or some other term versus CBD on the front of the label. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I love that. And, a few years ago, I had a different line, 2015, 2016, I was not using the word CBD on any of my product labels. I was using hemp extract, aerial parts, something like that. But I've really softened up to that. And, this is definitely an inflection point in the history of the cannabis plant and in dietary supplements in general. So as we look at where we are, we'll look back in 20 years, we'll say that was a wild time around, 2020, 2021, because there's really there's not a lot of similarities between what we see happening in the hemp world now. So what I mean by that is the federal government calls CBD not a lawful dietary supplement. That being said, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, so the wine is out of the bottle, so to speak. So we're actually at a point where companies are saying, well, it's not a legal dietary ingredient, I'm not going to use it, but there are so many other brands, I think over 3,000 brands at the beginning of this year, what I read, that are saying, well, we believe in this product, we believe in this plant, we're going to just go forward with making it. And so that has to do with the labeling of CBD. And as with any emerging industry, it's really important to come together with community to develop best practices, but it's also important to ensure that you're being accurate with your product labeling. So I would say that labeling a product with CBD is just fine. It's very low risk right now. And when I say very low risk, what I mean is that this is based on FDA or FTC enforcement trends. So the FDA has, again, come out and said, CBD is not a lawful dietary ingredient, but all of their warning letters, I believe all of them except for one, if I'm remembering correctly, have to do with companies making claims. So again, if a company is making a hemp CBD or hemp cannabinoid product and they're labeling CBD on the label, they're following GMPs, they're food facility registered, they're making sure that their product's safe, and they're not making claims. This is pretty low risk in the world of
so you're saying what's low risk is using CBD on the front of the label if, in fact, you have all those other things in place.
That's correct. Yes. Thank you.
I usually advise companies to not use the CBD on the label because I have seen specific verbiage about, the FDA not liking that word used, and especially if it's being mailed, and especially if it's going through interstate commerce, and then certain states are stricter than others. So I think you're right, though. There's so many, like they can't go after everyone.
Yep, it's so true. So again, if a company is following GMPs, they're being truthful, not misleading, they're labeling the product accurately. I believe it is a supplement if you're ingesting it. That's really the ticket to player to enter. And I'm glad you mentioned the state regulations and the interstate commerce or transportation, because just like on the marijuana side, the CBD side has a really bizarre state-by-state fabric of regulations. For example, Indiana requires a QR code that links back to the amount of CBD in the product, and it requires a certain amount of tests. Louisiana requires a pre-registration and has the really kind of wonky regulations. In my opinion, they don't want their product to be labeled as a dietary supplement. They want it to be labeled with nutrition facts. So the reason I bring up these two examples with Indiana and Louisiana is to share with the listeners that selling CBD is not easy, because if a company wants to make a product, for example, in Colorado and ship it across state lines to another state, then I would have to comply with that state's regulation. And a lot of them, Ellen, are actually requiring CBD content to be listed on the label, whereas some are actually not. So it's pretty confusing.
Right. And then besides the CBD, they maybe want to look at some of the actives such as cannabidiol and looking at a specific percent that might be in there. So you're right. Overall, it is confusing. So if anybody out there is thinking about doing this as a business, I think it's a very, very good idea to get in touch with a regulatory consultant such as Asa and his business, Dietary Supplements. What is the best way for people to find you? The website, do you think, is the easiest way?
Yeah, I think the website is really the best way, asawaldstein.com. I'm also very active on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I believe I'm the only Asa Waldstein on LinkedIn as well, too.
So, that is really wise because people think they're going to do this until what you just said is so profound, particularly in the whole hemp and CBD and beyond that into the THC-related marijuana industry. Now, are you involved at all with the dispensaries that actually are selling the high THC products?
Not so much. Not so much. Primary focus of my business is on the dietary supplement and hemp world. I am asked to consult on claims made in the THC world, but that's a small portion of my company.
See, that's a whole big word, though, that you said. First of all, you were talking about GMPs. GMPs, for our listeners, are about the rules and regulations for making a product. Everything from how high the sink has to be and all kinds of regulations that are very, very complicated and that most people, I have to say, cannot get to. Not unless you really have a huge amount of money that you're willing to invest up front in creating a manufacturing facility that will meet all these GMPs. However, then moving forward into the labeling, that's another whole massive issue.
Yeah, it is so true. And the way the FDA looks at labeling is anything. If you make a statement, for example, on your social media, that's considered an extension of labeling. So labeling in the digital era has really taken on a broader terminology as well, too.
Well, believe it or not, we are getting very close to the end of our discussion. You have such a huge amount of information to share, and those videos that you're preparing are excellent. And I'll tell you, after all the years I've been doing this as well, when I've watched them, I've learned more. There's always more to learn. So just tell our listeners again how to best get in touch with you.
Perfect. So to everyone out there, our Herbally Yours listeners and everyone in the cyber world, you can get a hold of me at asawaldstein.com. That's my name, asawaldstein.com. And I look forward to connecting with anybody. If anybody has questions regarding regulatory items or just wants to chit-chat about dietary supplements, I'm always open.
Thank you, Asa, and thank you, listeners, for tuning into Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.